I'm almost done setting up the shade cloth. I still am going to go back in and adjust some things, tighten others. But before I finish setting up this one to this post right here, I'm going to attach the last piece of shade cloth. And I want to do this now because otherwise it's going to be way too high for me to reach later on. Last year, when I was waiting towards the end to attach pieces, it was such a nightmare. It took forever. And it looks like the storm might be coming in again soon, so I gotta hurry up. I'm definitely not gonna get to do the string lights today, but maybe I can finish those up tomorrow or something. So far, connecting the shade cloth hasn't been that difficult. Last year I struggled with it a lot, but that was also because it was really, really hot. I did set it up during the summertime. It was blistering out here. This time around it's a lot easier, thankfully. Oh God, I think I just cut myself. Okay. Things I do for this garden, man. Ah. Okay, one down. I am trying to leave every little bit completed before I move on to the next one, just because maybe this will just make things easier for me. Something that cracks me up is whenever I'm working on projects out here, and even when I'm not, but especially when I'm working on projects, the hummingbirds love to zoom up to me and just check to see what I'm working on, and then they fly away. And I think it's probably one of the cutest things that I get to experience in the whole garden. Levi and Mika are indoors right now just because they're so cute, but they're very, very obnoxious, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't have any disturbance while I was up on the ladder. Okay, almost done. Connecting these. Here, thankfully, I started using the needle nose pliers to pull the metal zip ties as tightly as possible so that if there was ever any crazy wind, it wouldn't tug the shade cloth back and forth and then continue to tighten it, because then there would be a little piece that would be sticking out that would be sharp enough to cut through the shade cloth. And when I first started setting it up in Iokai and the beginning of Aurora Boulevard, I didn't do that. I started trying to tighten it by hand, and I ended up regretting it later on. So I feel like doing it this way definitely took more time. It was a little bit more annoying to try and tighten those zip ties as much as possible, but later on it did pay off. So I wish that I had done that with all of the shade fabric, but it took me a while before I actually started implementing that little technique. And as I've mentioned before, if I could go back, would I use the metal zip ties again? Nope. I know that they are probably a little bit better to use because they're sturdier. You don't have to buy as many plastic ones. The problem with the plastic ones is that depending on which ones you get, when the sun gets so intense in the low desert, everything becomes brittle. I have seen it time and time again where the sun makes the zip ties so brittle that you can take your fingers and just tear them off because they snap really quickly. They're very, very weak after they've been in the sun for a couple of months. The metal zip ties don't have that particular issue, but they come with their own set of problems, I feel like. Or maybe it was just the metal zip ties that I used because I bought mine at Harbor Freight, so maybe there's other brands out there that are better, that could be tightened more, that would just be more suitable for this project. But in my case, I use these, and these really put me off from trying metal zip ties in the future because of how annoying they were to work with. It doesn't mean that I never will though, but it made me more hesitant to try and use metal zip ties again. Ah, I felt a raindrop. Let me hurry up. Oops, my tripod. Okay. When I first started working on this project, I had a completely different plan on what I was going to do to set up the shade cloth. And as I was working on the project, I started changing my mind, which is how I often do things. And because of that, there's a few things that I know now that I would change. For example, I didn't measure where I was putting the conduit pulls. However, because of this, the grommets on the shade cloth didn't line up perfectly with the conduit pulls. There was a couple where I got really lucky and it just worked out perfectly, but then there was a few others like this one where it wasn't necessarily lined up perfectly, but I really wanted the shade cloth to remain taut. So I did this by tying portions of it together, by using zip ties, by using clothesline, and then to attach the actual shade cloth to the pole, I started using some screw link or quick links, I think is what they're called. But basically, they're these little metal ovals that have a little screw portion, and I was able to get it through the grommet and through the little eyelet that I put into the conduit pole. And the reason I went with these is not necessarily because they were my first choice. To be honest with you, what I really wanted to use was something called galvanized carabiner. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Spring snaps. And they're basically those hooks that you can just snap on and off, but they hold pretty good and you can hold a lot of weight. They come in different sizes. But the issue with these is that I couldn't find any that were inexpensive enough for my budget at the time. I had already spent so much money on the conduit poles, on the Tapcon screws, but the biggest expense of all was actually the shade cloth. Because as you can see, I had to buy several different pieces of shade cloth to be able to cover my entire backyard. And when I found these quick links, I was really excited because I thought, okay, they're probably not gonna rust. They came in a pack, I think it was either 2 or 4, but I found them at Harbor Freight for a very reasonable price. So I thought, okay, this I think is going to be more of a permanent solution. Although it's not my first choice, it's still gonna work. And it did work. However, if I could go back and redo it, I would have just invested in the spring snaps, the carabiner spring snaps, because I feel like with those, I could attach a shade cloth and then detach it for stormy, windy days where the wind is so intense that trees get broken, branches get broken, conduit poles get bent, and the shade cloth sort of acts like a sail. So it can become a little bit more damaged if I don't take it down, but I didn't think about that at this point because in the low desert, yes, it does get windy a lot of the time, but I feel like the really, really, really intense winds are usually around times where there are storms, either dust storms or rainstorms, but that's not very often. The majority of the year, it's very dry. There's gusts of wind, but they're not that bad. However, I feel like it's better to just be prepared in case of a really bad storm so that my shade cloth isn't torn up because it was a really big investment. And so that's what you'll see me using to attach the shade cloth is those screw links or quick links. And I wouldn't use those again. Number one, because the opening on them is a little bit more narrow, or at least with the ones that I used. But number two, over time, the little screwed part, I feel like it kind of got stuck and it was really hard to take apart, especially when it's up next to the conduit pole. Whereas with the spring snaps, I feel like it would have been a lot easier for me to attach and detach the shade cloth. Once I was finally done attaching this conduit pole, I was hoping I would be done, but I still had Citrus Lane left to do. And I was excited about that though, because I felt like once I got to Citrus Lane, I was in the clear. I was basically going to be entirely done with all of the white shade cloth, and that's exactly what I wanted because a day like today does not come very often, and so when it does, I really, really need to take advantage of it. Yes, I was feeling very, very tired and exhausted, but having that back support belt or vest on definitely helped me as I climbed up and down the ladder. And I think I got it in my head that I didn't want to stop until I had done as much as I could. And Citrus Lane was last on my list, for today at least. But I'll show you the rest of that in the next video.